My name's QuickPickNick, and using all of my algorithms and simulations, here are your locks and lotteries from May 30th. And yes, here we are, reviving a bit of an older series, but in a different light, because those 1 minute starting 5 videos didn't really seem to be doing it for YouTube. If you did like those shorter videos though, I'll still be posting those alongside every locks and lotteries on my TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram, all of which you can find in the bio. But for now, I'm going to be posting locks and lotteries instead on my YouTube channel, so stay tuned for all of that. Let me know in the comments if you like this format better than starting 5. Either way, both are available. Pick your poison, really. And without stalling any further, if you are here for one of the starting 5 videos, then you already know that we're going to be taking Kyrie Irving as our first point guard. He's going to be our first lock in this new format, this new series, mainly because of his extremely low cost considering his regular season performance. Now, I know that during this series in particular against Boston, he's kind of fallen off a little bit. He's scoring about 30 fantasy points per game in these 3 games he's played so far, but even so, I don't think that's much of a downside considering his extremely low cost. I mean, 8,400 isn't really that low, but when you compare it to his average of 30 as a base almost, if worst case scenario is 30, looking at his regular season stats of 45 fantasy points per game, if that's a best case, if we even see a glimpse of that, maybe bump it up to 35 or 40 fantasy points if you take an average or so, then we're really getting something worth our money here for $8,400. Now for our second point guard, obviously you're going to want to look at Luka Doncic here, not because you want to take him, but because you're going to want to monitor his injury, because right now it's questionable as to whether he's going to play in game 4 or not. And so if he doesn't play, all the rest of Dallas's cast really gets elevated in their value. Just something to watch. I don't think he's probably worth taking, especially with that huge price tag, but either way, monitor his status because you might want to be taking Dallas players if Doncic is inactive. For our second point guard, we're going to be taking Kemba Walker, coming in at his cheap 6,500. I think this is more of a lottery instead of a lock is what I'm going to designate him as, but I still think he's a pretty good pick, especially for his low cost. It looks like he's going to play in game 4. If he doesn't, obviously take him out of your lineup, but keep a close eye on him. The reason he's a lottery is because he's only had one good game this series. That's game 2 against Brooklyn. He scored 31 fantasy points. The rest of them have been high 10s, teens level, but still he scored 33 in the regular season per game as an average, and I think that he has a good chance to bounce back here and get another game like that game 2 in the 30s range. So for 6,500, I think it's worth the risk. Now moving on to the shooting guard position, we have a few picks here. Again, starting 5 video already has a sneak peek of who I'm going with here. It's going to be another Celtic, this time Marcus Smart. Smart has really been a huge part of this series for the Celtics, and that's because he's really come out of nowhere. Well, not nowhere. He's been a decent player all season, but he's really stepped up his game and, solidified himself in the starting lineup. He's got 34 fantasy points per game in the last game. Even before that, he scored 36. A little bit weaker in game 1. However, the average is still pretty high, around 32 fantasy points per game in this series for Smart, and especially with his 30 fantasy points per game in the regular season, it doesn't look like that average is going to be dropping anytime soon, maybe only rising around that 35 mark during this series. For the other shooting guard, someone really cheap who you can save a lot of money on is Kevin Huerter. He's been doing pretty decently for this series, and for someone who costs below $5,000, you can get some solid value out of Huerter. The last game he played in the series against New York, he scored about 19 points. In the game before that, 30. In the game before that, 22. And so I think we have a player here who has high potential with a very low cost. Even if he does score another 19-pointer, that's kind of expected from a $4,800 player. And so we have that huge upside from games 1 and 2. Game 3 was kind of let down a little bit, but I think we're going to be seeing Kevin Huerter worked regularly into this Atlanta Hawks lineup. Now moving on to small forward, I think that if you can afford any of these top 3 players, LeBron James, Kawhi Leonard, or Kevin Durant, they all seem worth their costs. It's just I wasn't able to work them into this lineup because I want to spread out my cash more, but if you want to consolidate and put a lot of your cash into LeBron or Kawhi or Kevin Durant, I think it's worth it. It's just 10,000 is too much for this lineup in particular, not too much for what they're probably going to give you 50s or 60s points. Now for our actual pick from the starting 5 video, Evan Fournier is a solid 5,500 pick from Boston who has really been showing up similarly to Marcus Smart in this series. You can see that his regular season average is 28.5, which isn't bad at all for a $5,500 player, and looking at this series in particular, he's bouncing right around 25 fantasy points, which again isn't a bad average for this cost. For $5,500, I'd take 25 as a floor, and you see that upside, that 28.5. I think this is just a safe pick all around. I'd maybe consider this one a limbo, somewhere in between lock and lottery. He hasn't fallen into that 10s range this series, but he hasn't made it into the 30s range either, so it's kind of a safe play. And so if you think that this is a solid addition to your lineup, I don't think you can really go wrong with Fournier here. He's cheap, he's consistent, and he'll score you enough points to warrant his cost. For the second small forward, a bit more of a lottery, I took DeAndre Hunter, and the reason behind that is mainly cost for obvious reasons. $4,600 is really low and something that we can afford in basically every lineup. You're obviously sacrificing that LeBron or Kawhi or Durant position since you're taking Hunter and Fournier, two really cheap guys, instead of either of the expensive ones. But I think that going cheap at small forward isn't a bad idea idea either. I think either spending a lot or a little is the play for this slate. You see here, although Hunter had a weak game 1, not even scoring 10 points, in his past 2 contests, he scored above 20 fantasy points, which is more than enough for $4,600. Now moving on to power forward, another pick that you saw in the starting 5 video, if you watched that and you're coming here from there, is Kristaps Porzingis. I would consider this guy a lottery, and while we're on it, I'm going to also add in John Collins as the second power forward and another lottery at the position. The reason both of these guys are lotteries is because they're both strong players, at least from the regular season, but for whatever reason in these series in particular, they have been struggling heavily. Looking at Porzingis, for example, he scored about 20 fantasy points in 2 of the 3 games in this series so far, with his only high point around 40 fantasy points, which isn't much more than his regular average from 2021. $6,900 is very affordable though, and I think that taking the risk that he might get back to his regular season self, and if we see another game 2 where he scores 40 fantasy points, that's well worth the $6,900, and so I think it's worth taking the risk in this case. Again, he's a lottery because he might just score another 20 points. John Collins is kind of the same story as Porzingis with $5,800 price tag. He's obviously a lot cheaper and a little bit of a lesser extent as Porzingis. He's cheaper, he scores less points, but it's sort of the same story, honestly. He scored 5 points in game 2 against New York, and in his other 2, he hasn't really done that much either, scoring an average of 26 across those 2. And so he hasn't really stepped up into his own against New York in this series for Atlanta, but looking at his regular season average of 31 fantasy points per game, if we can see somewhat of a middle ground between those, maybe a high 20s point game, I think that'd be worth the $5,800. It's not that much to ask for around 30 points. Finally, at center, I think there are a few picks here that you can't really go wrong with. I think that Ayton has been really doing a lot in this series against LA and is probably worth that $7,700 price tag. Tristan Thompson also has been doing a lot, especially recently. Keep an eye out on Robert Williams. If he's unable to play, I think Thompson immediately becomes a lock in your lineup. Thompson has been huge for the Celtics recently, and I think he's going to be huge in this game as well, but the player we're going to be taking in this lineup in particular is Clint Capella, just because his budget fits in perfectly with the rest of the lineup. Looking more specifically at Capella, I think that he's just a safe option all around. 35 fantasy points per game, actually 35.4 fantasy points per game in both games 2 and 3, exactly 30 in game 1. That's a solid floor that I don't think Capella's going to fall below. I think he can only go up from 30. You see a 40 fantasy point per game average in the regular season. We might be able to see some of that tonight. And so there you have it, a full lineup for this slate. I don't think that this one is the most exciting per se, considering we have 4 Atlanta players and a few Boston players, and so you're not really getting that much diversity across the day. It might be bored during the Phoenix game, considering we have no Phoenix in LA. So definitely don't lock this lineup in if you want to take like a LeBron I was talking about earlier, Ayton. I know Booker is also a solid pick. He had a lot of value in my simulations. Go ahead and do it. Like Smart should be locked in. I think Irving is a pretty good bet. Porzingis if Doncic doesn't play. Either way, thanks for watching. If you like these full lineup builder videos or just daily fantasy sports stuff, be sure to subscribe down below. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, what I can change to make it better for you guys. Either way, this has been Quick Picnic, the intersection for sports, data analysis, and speed. Thanks for watching.